What is conflict resilience? How do you handle disagreements and differences with integrity while finding a way to create strong, deep, and lasting relationships? I will explore these questions and so much more with my very special guests, Bob Bordone and Dr. Joelle Salinas, authors of Conflict Resilience, Negotiating Disagreement Without Giving Up or Giving In. Yeah, I like the fact that you are suggesting to folks that they redefine the negativity that is that I guess is presumed about conflict, and the fact that this is just energy, if you will. And I want to get back to the idea of conflict resilience, because we all know, and I know you, Bob, from your background, we know what conflict resolution is as a discipline, if you will. But I was wondering, could you define for us how you came up, or what made you pull that term together of conflict resilience, and how does it differ from traditional approaches to conflict resolution? And maybe in these answers, both you and Joelle, you can talk about the common excuses people use and how they can shift towards diagnosing the root causes of conflict to seize that opportunity you talked about, Bob.
Sure. So maybe I'll offer kind of a little definition of what we mean and how it's different, and then let Joelle talk about some of the common handling approaches and what we could do differently. So conflict resilience as opposed to resolution, I think resolution, right, suggests how do we find a solution to the problem, whether that is jointly arrived at, which is, through negotiation, which is kind of where my professional kind of roots are, right, or mediation, which is a third person helping people find a solution, or whether that is through a whole host of other ways that people solve their problems, some of which are better or worse, right? Whether that's courts, which can be costly, but at least nonviolent, wars, or violence. Resilience doesn't presume or get to the solving piece. It is more about having both the capacity or mindset for sitting in the discomfort with the other person or persons with whom we have the strong disagreement. And finding ways to, in a very non-avoidant and effectively assertive way, communicate our view, but also how do we open ourselves up to perspective taking, to listening, to seeing how the other sees it, quite apart from whether or not there is going to be common ground, whether or not there is going to be a solution. And part of, you ask kind of, how did I come to this? And I think, hearkening back to this observation that I started to see, I would say circa around 2015 or so, both in our society and also in students that I was teaching, was just a real studied avoidance, a sense of, I don't want to be made to feel uncomfortable. And we saw that in certain kinds of societal things that would come up, whether it's trigger warnings or cancel culture, and then add to that kind of social media, which allows us to create these kinds of cocoons of comfort, and started to see like a real cost that was having, not just, or even particularly in classrooms, but also just in organizations, right? And then there was this kind of moment. I mean, I think these ideas were forming in my mind, and then there was a moment in 2018 when I had a chance to speak at a conference called Pop Tech, and at the very last minute, this is kind of an embarrassing but true story. I just changed a word at the very beginning of my talk. I said I was going to say, I've been teaching conflict resolution for about 20 years, and I'm going to talk to you about blah, blah. And then I said, I've been teaching conflict resolution for about 20 years, but that's not what I'm going to talk to you today about. I'm going to talk to you about something different and use this word, conflict resilience. And I found that it resonated. So that's kind of where it comes from. I think that's how it's different. Like, one of the things that Joelle said that is very true, right, earlier, is that this quality or capacity is really prerequisite. It's foundational before we can actually do effective conflict resolution that isn't extremely high cost and destructive. That we have to be willing and be brave enough to sit there quite uncomfortably, where the conversation doesn't always end with the three things we're going to do together and tie the bow and here's the common ground. And I would just say one more thing on this. The reason why that's important is because I think in this moment, people are less sometimes interested in doing this because they say, there is no common ground. So what's the point? And one of the arguments that we have in our book is that there's a very high and important point, which is that even if you don't find common ground, which we think you often would if you do this well, but even if you don't, let's say you don't, the work of sitting with the discomfort of the disagreement prevents demonization. It prevents dehumanization. It prevents us telling stories about the other where they're kind of thin cartoon character. And we need that right now, both as a country, right, but also in our organizations and even in our families. So, Joelle, you should talk about how people actually act.
Yeah, no, I think one of the reasons why this skill set's really important is, the way that we respond to conflict is very much ingrained within our biology. And specifically, there's this kind of set of like reactions that we are all prone to have when we come into conflict, or even the perception of what could be conflict. And we kind of call this like the 5 Fs, which is a fight, flight, flee, fawn, and fester. And these are just kind of some examples of common reactions. And you may have a different one. You may use different kind of reactions in different situations. But the idea here is that kind of our brains have kind of developed a reflex for what we do in the setting of a potential threat, what we're perceiving the conflict as a threat. And in the past, it might have served us by kind of decreasing the amount of distress around the conflict, made us feel a little bit better, maybe it did kind of assuage kind of the conflict situation kind of temporarily. But what ends up happening is your brain develops this kind of reward and reinforcement cycle that then tells you, okay, when you're in this type of conflict, give up or run away or kind of yell and scream and just get the other person's kind of point of view out of the way. And the problem there is that it ends up not really serving us kind of for the long term. It ends up being kind of a very kind of myopic way of managing the conflict up front, and doesn't really serve us very well. And that's how we lose a lot of these really kind of powerful opportunities to take advantage of what conflict can really bring to us. Because if we're constantly fleeing, we're constantly avoiding conflict, I mean, that certainly is not going to serve you in kind of your career development, your career goals. It's certainly not going to serve you in kind of your personal life or in romantic relationships. And I think it's just really critical because conflict is everywhere, right? Conflict can even just be kind of differences that we have with another person, or disagreements that we have about day-to-day things. And if we're not able to handle the discomfort of that conflict, there's no way that we can really skillfully handle that conflict in a way that really sort of meets our needs and our desires. And that's kind of what we want, is not just to kind of help to support better relationships and better organizations and a better society, but almost in a like slightly selfish way, just so that way you have a better an opportunity, so that the odds are in your favor, that when you come across conflict, that you'll be able to respond in a way that is much more aligned with the outcome that you want out of the situation.
That's a very important. I mean, two essential points that you both make is when Bob mentioned the fact that we need it more than ever to look at things this way, so we're not making caricatures of each other, but also the idea that this, by becoming more resilient, we can find a way to get to what we need. And where I'm going now is to sort of transition to the subtitle of your book, because it suggests a focus on negotiating disagreement without, and this is where giving up or giving in. My question to you both is, what are your insights for how to achieving that? How do we achieve that balance?
Yeah, I mean, I think we were very deliberate about bringing in the term negotiation. And part of it is that there is, and this kind of speaks to what Bob was saying earlier, is, what we want to make sure that we're emphasizing is not conflict resolution, but really how do we manage the conflict or navigate it kind of better with kind of conflict resilience. And so there's this kind of negotiation that really happens. And oftentimes when we come into a conflict situation where, two people really don't see eye to eye, you may find common ground, but you might not find common ground. There's this kind of tendency that we might have to just kind of give up on the situation altogether, kind of like what I referred to before, kind of with like fleeing or fighting, one of those kind of default reactions, or just kind of giving in. So really, it's figuring out how we can better navigate these situations. And to do that, we kind of try to come up with a framework that really encapsulates a lot of the skills and that kind of capacity building around conflict resilience. And a lot of that kind of really begins with this kind of framework of name, explore, commit. Really kind of naming and exploring and kind of committing to that conflict. Bob, I'll hand it off to you to kind of break each step down a little bit further, but I think that's the overarching kind of like answer to that question, like how do we do it? And that's that framework that kind of ties it all together.
Yeah, and thanks, Joel. Part of the subtitle is, as Joel said, we wanted both the word negotiation, which I guess often I think makes people think of agreement, but we also wanted to really stress that disagreement also needs to be negotiated. Um, and it can be done in a way that isn't just kind of avoidance or collapsing. Around our framework, I think this may probably will not be surprising to the listeners. Um, the name piece, the first piece, is really focused, perhaps counterintuitively, internally. Um, that is, how do we name what is going on in ourself when we experience disagreement, when we experience the kind of tension and anxiety of conflict? And we try to really do that, I would say, at kind of several levels, right? For me as a collaborator with Joelle, the most kind of interesting, because it was the newest for me, is what's just going on like in our brains, right? Like, at the level of like, chemicals and neurons and the kind of whole evolution of humanity. But we also kind of try to do it just at an experiential level, like what are you feeling and thinking? And often that work is identifying um, the kind of internal conflicts or stories. And so I think this is an answer to your question, Michael. A big piece where I think the first part of like not giving up or giving in really matters, which is finding a way to give voice and life to the different stories you may have, right? The on the one hand, I should raise this, and on the other hand, it will go badly. On the one hand, this is important for me. On the other hand, it will upset them. And so that's really the naming piece is a lot of self-diagnosis and then a lot of giving people some tools. We kind of coin this mirror work. So tools to kind of identify and place their internal kind of conflicts that also include the emotions associated with them. The explore piece or the second piece is okay, now that I've done this, how do I bring that into the room? How do I, what are the ways that I can actually speak to somebody, whether it's, again, fill in the blank, boss, staff member, team, mother, father, sister, brother, political opponent in the ways that are really authentic and true, but also that maximize the chances that the other can hear. And then how do I cultivate enough genuine curiosity to listen to them? And then the third kind of piece of the book around commit, I think tackles some of the important yeah but questions that we faced in our writing, right? Which is yeah, but like, what if there's trauma or harm here? What if the person is on the other side is not acting in bad faith, right? And so part of what we try to do is give folks some tools for assessing that question and help them think through how do they decide whether, when we say commit, right? How do they decide whether they should commit to anything from an agreement to staying in the conversation to staying in the relationship? Or commit to exit. And what does that look like? An exit isn't always possible. You can exit a relationship with your best friend. You can't exit the fact that someone is your daughter. And so the commit piece really speaks to that. And then I think also speaks to, and I think this is really important for business and organizational leaders. How can you commit to creating an organizational environment that makes it easier for people to be conflict resilient, that doesn't impose high costs for people giving voice to their kind of internal and conflict itself.
My next question is around like any practical strategies or tools you could from the book you want to talk about that could help, navigate conflicts within government organization settings. And, I'm wondering, are there any, we talked about mirroring, but are there any other practical exercises or self-assessments that leaders can use to better understand and improve their conflict resilience?
Yeah, I mean that is a really important question, and I think the answer is yes. But so part of it, I think, is doing some assessment around what your experience of organizational culture is. And the last part of our book, we really kind of use this analogy of a greenhouse, right? So we talk about you may have some amazing genetically modified seed that's going to grow the most tasty and rich tomato, but if you like put it in the soil in February in Boston, it ain't going to grow. Right, you have to create the climate that I think helps promote a culture of conflict resilience. And some of that I think is leading by example. So like showing some vulnerability and tapping into conversations that are not just about facts, but also about understanding the emotional landscape, modeling some of that emotional complexity. I think because I think people are paying more attention to what you do than what you say. So, a lot of the, I think, research that Amy Edmondson at Harvard Business School has done around psychological safety has a very direct correlation in terms of creating, conflict resilient, supportive environments, for sure. One of the things I think we talk about, this may sound very meta, but I think it's actually really important, and even really important, maybe in particular, in this kind of highly polarized moment, which is that sometimes you're not ready to have the conversation about X, but you could actually have a conversation about what would be the best way to talk about X with each other. That feels very meta, um, but I think is a way of jointly or co-constructing really a culture, a shared culture of how can we have the hard conversations. And I mean, we use some phraseology in there that some of which I think we developed, and some of which frankly we just have seen in other places. Like there's something you talk about in the book called Be Raggedy, which is really something that I got from my work at Seeds of Peace, which is an organization that does dialogue work with Israelis and Palestinians and Indians and Pakistanis. So folks who are, really in existential conflicts with each other. And the notion of Be Raggedy, which is simply an invitation to say, do the best you can to speak what you're experiencing. It doesn't need to be eloquent. And I'm going to give you the benefit of the doubt on the other side. And by the way, if it lands poorly, I'll let you know, but I will separate that out from your intention.
Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of like tactics, I would also add on here, maybe one that may feel somewhat straightforward, but is actually kind of a challenge is just an awareness of how you're experiencing conflict and how you're handling it. Awareness is more than half the battle a lot of the time. And thinking of just like the biology of it and of like how your body is responding to conflict can already begin to give you some insights in terms of what situations may be trickier for you and can kind of highlight for you where you might need to do some work and do some more practice or repetitions. Um, and in particular, it's just kind of really getting a sense for kind of when your heart rate is going up, when you feel hot or flush, or maybe your hands feel cold. There's an element of kind of like mindfulness and really understanding how you're reacting to that conflict. And in the moment, it may not be the easiest, but you want to build that awareness muscle that'll help you kind of then understand, oh, I need to do something about this to kind of calm my nervous system because of how I typically kind of perceive this conflict. And in the book, we offer some skills. Like one of my favorite ones, this thing called cyclic sighing, where it's really about kind of having a controlled breath with a very long exhale, which is more likely to kind of stimulate kind of your parasympathetic nervous system, which helps to kind of almost like a hot wire kind of your nervous system so that way it slows your heart rate and lowers your blood pressure. So the way that psychic sighing works is you take in a deep breath in through your nose. You really fill up kind of like your lung capacity at the very end, the tippy top of kind of that breath. You take in one little extra inhale through your nose, and then you do a long, slow exhale out through your mouth. And the extra little inhale through your nose, what's helpful there, it kind of opens up the air sacs kind of in your lungs, gets you a little bit more oxygen. And the whole process also helps to send a message to your brain to then kind of slow that heart rate down and slow that blood pressure. So that way, it's just one less thing for you mentally to have to fight against, which is kind of that physical feeling of fight or flight when you're in that conflict situation.
So, for both of you, what are the key takeaways you hope readers will gain from your book, Conflict Resilience?
I mean, I think one of the things that I would love for people to gain from the book is just a new perspective about kind of conflict. And even if they just are more attuned to when conflict is happening and how they perceive conflict and how they navigate that conflict with others, I think that's already pretty substantial. Like I said, awareness is more than half the battle here. And, we don't have to be perfect in it, but I think just being able to be more skillful in how we connect with each other through conflict will have a pretty tremendous impact in people's lives. And I think they'll be surprised to see how quickly that they feel that positive impact.
Yeah, and I would echo what Joel said, and I'm gonna go for something very bold here, but we intentionally took conflict resilience as the title. That was always the title because the subtitle we worked a lot on, as Joel said, the main title we didn't. I think the takeaway is that conflict resilience, meaning that ability to put yourself into the discomfort, the unpleasantness, and the toughness of disagreement is an absolutely an indispensable leadership skill that you cannot be an effective leader in a pluralistic and diverse work environment without that, because you can't take advantage of all of the great things that a diverse work environment brings because what it brings is the disagreement. What it brings is the messiness. And if you don't have that capacity to put yourself into that fire, then you can't succeed. So that it is akin to emotional intelligence, right? It is akin to, 30 or 40 years ago, I'm not sure a job description would say required emotional intelligence. But now we kind of use that phrase. And I want people to really feel that viscerally. And then from that, hopefully then the desire to develop it and learn the skills, et cetera. I feel like there's like an attractiveness of our book, but honestly, like there's a toughness, right? Like this is a book that offers lots of hacks and tips and tricks, and you can absolutely improve wherever you are on this, but it is not easy.
This has been a special edition of the Business of Government Hour, a conversation with authors with Bob Bordone and Dr. Joel Salinas, authors of Conflict Resilience, Negotiating Disagreement Without Giving Up or Giving In, available from any online bookseller. Be sure to join us next time for another informative, insightful, and in-depth conversation on improving government leadership and its effectiveness. Until then, subscribe, download, and listen to the entire interview at Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Audible, or on your favorite podcast app, and as always at businessofgovernment.org.